Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're turning our attention to a part of Scripture that I think for many is it's deeply intimidating, but at the same time, it's profoundly encouraging.
It really is.
We're drawing on a rich Bible essay that explores one of the most intense challenges, both psychological and physical,
Yeah,
that Israel ever faced: the Anakites.
that's right. And I think our objective for this deep dive is to go beyond just, reciting the facts. We
Yeah.
really want to explore the story and the immense spiritual significance of these people, often called the Anakim.
Right.
I mean, these figures are consistently portrayed as some of the most dreaded opposition Israel ran into on their whole journey to the Promised Land.
It wasn't just that they were powerful, right? The
Exactly.
text makes it clear they were literal giants, and they were living in these cities that were fortified in a way that
Yeah.
just it defied normal military conquest.
Absolutely. Their very presence struck this paralyzing fear into people, and their name itself became synonymous in the ancient world with an insurmountable obstacle.
When you slow down and actually read the accounts, especially in Numbers and Joshua, it becomes so clear that the Anakites represent something more than just a military hurdle. They were the ultimate roadblock, both mentally and spiritually.
Yes. And the essay really emphasizes this core, timeless conflict. It suggests this whole narrative is so much more than just ancient history.
So much more.
It is, and that's really the central theme we have to carry through our whole discussion. The story of the Anakites is this profound, recurring reminder of how God's faithful promises are, well, they're invariably tested by circumstances that just seem utterly impossible to human sight.
To what we can see, yeah.
Exactly. The narrative is really constructed to emphasize that victory, the true victory for a believer. It's never achieved by, comparing our strength to the size of the giant. Instead, it's won solely by faith in the Lord. It shows how fear completely paralyzes us while genuine faith, it overcomes all of those perceived limits.
That sets a really powerful mission for us today. And to really appreciate the context and, the timeless relevance of it all, we're going to walk slowly through the stages of their story, just as it's presented in our source material.
A good plan.
So we'll start by establishing their historical and cultural background, then trace the turning points in the biblical narrative, synthesize the deep theological significance of their defeat, and then finally we'll land on the practical application. How do we recognize and face our own giants today?
It's a very thorough framework. I think we should start by establishing exactly who these formidable people were and why their reputation was so intimidating, not just physically, but culturally, within the whole region of Canaan. #I, historical and cultural background.
Okay, so let's unpack this historical identity first. The essay starts by identifying the Anakites as descendants of a Canaanite patriarch named Anak. But they weren't just an isolated family line, were they? What's the larger context here?
No, they certainly weren't isolated, and that's a key point. The source material places the Anakites within a much larger known category of giant peoples called the Rephaim.
The Rephaim.
Yes. The term itself, Rephaim, it seems to denote, tall or mighty ones, or perhaps even those connected to a very ancient, almost legendary lineage. And while the Rephaim were widespread, they occupied territories all through Canaan, Edom, Moab, the Anakites were distinct. They were the most famous, and critically, they were concentrated in a highly strategic region.
And that specific strategic region being the southern hill country of Judah.
Precisely. This geography is absolutely essential to understanding their power. Their chief stronghold was the ancient, strategically vital city of Hebron.
Which was known by another name back then.
That's right, Kiriath Arba. The city wasn't just large, it was situated way up in the highlands, making it a natural fortress. Control of Hebron meant you controlled the critical trade routes that ran through the high country. It gave you a massive military advantage over any army trying to come to Canaan from the south or the east.
So if you wanted to conquer the Promised Land, you couldn't go around them. You had to confront and dismantle the Anakites' central command right there at Hebron.
There was no other way, so their formidable reputation was really this compound threat. It was based on their sheer physical stature, but equally on them holding this key piece of real estate, which was protected by these immense fortifications.
It's just layer upon layer of intimidation.
Absolutely, and their very name, Anak, it just contributes to the whole mythos. While, the precise linguistic meaning is debated, most scholars agree it strongly connotes strength or neck length or just great stature, which fits their reputation perfectly. Everything about them was designed to communicate impossibility and just deter anyone from even approaching.
They were the ultimate expression of human might combined with geographical advantage.
Well said.
And this inherent intimidation, it leads us to that fascinating point the essay makes about the impression they made on the Israelites. This quick link the spies made between the Anakites and the legendary Nephilim.
Ah, yes. This is a crucial point for understanding the psychological warfare at play. The essay clarifies that ancient Jewish tradition sometimes made this speculative connection between the Anakites and the Nephilim, the legendary powerful giants mentioned back in Genesis 6 who existed before the flood.
But it's important to be clear on this, right?
Very important. We have to stress that the scripture itself does not state that the Anakites were their literal direct descendants. And that detail is important because it prevents us from drifting off into, mythological speculation.
But the fact that the spies, the men who saw them with their own eyes, immediately jumped to that comparison, that they called them Nephilim, just on sight. I mean, that tells us so much about the level of terror they felt.
It speaks volumes, doesn't it? It tells you everything about the visceral, immediate impact. When those 12 men peered into Canaan, the Anakites weren't just tall. To them, they looked mythically large.
Like something out of a legend.
Exactly. They were so immense that the spies' minds immediately went to the most terrifying, powerful, and frankly, legendarily destructive figures known in their entire collective history. It wasn't just a military assessment they were making, it was an existential crisis. The sight of these giants instantly transformed them from Israelite warriors into children overwhelmed by an ancient, unbeatable evil.
So that visceral reaction suggests that to the skies, the Anakites were less a conquerable enemy and more a force of nature, something almost like the chaos that existed before the flood.
That is the precise danger of fear. It elevates the enemy above reality, and in this case, it elevated them above God's reality. Now, beyond their physicality and their strategic location, the source material forces us to confront their cultural and spiritual identity. It notes that their strength was deeply, deeply coupled with spiritual darkness.
And this is what moves the conflict from just a territorial dispute to a divine judgment.
Precisely. Culturally, they embodied the height of Canaanite society. Highly fortified cities, militarily advanced warriors, relying entirely on their own might, but spiritually, they were steeped in the profound idolatry of the region, and this wasn't some benign polytheism.
Help us understand the nature of that spiritual darkness a little more, as the essay emphasizes it. What kind of practices were going on that necessitated this extreme divine judgment?
Well, the religious environment of Canaan, and therefore of the Anakites, was one of profound corruption. They were deeply entrenched in the worship of false deities like Baal, the storm god often associated with fertility and power, and Asherah, the goddess linked to chaotic nature and immorality.
So we're not just talking about statues.
No, not at all. The essay implies their spiritual practices involved ritual immorality and sometimes even child sacrifice, all of it focused on manipulating the natural world for their own power and prosperity. These practices stood in direct, sharp opposition to the holiness and the justice demanded by the worship of the one true God, Yahweh.
So the divine decree for their removal wasn't just about land ownership. It was about cleaning a moral and spiritual infection out of the land so that Israel could maintain covenant purity. Their downfall was a necessary act of judgment against this corruption.
Absolutely essential. You've hit on it. It places the whole conflict within the proper theological framework. This was ultimately a spiritual battle manifesting in a military campaign. God was clearing the land of a deeply entrenched wickedness.
It's important to ask, though, did Israel achieve that complete eradication during the initial conquest under Joshua?
No, and this is a key detail that really shapes the next 400 years of Israelite history. The essay is very careful to note that not all Anakites were eradicated immediately. Remnants, these small but still powerful pockets, they survived, specifically in the Philistine cities along the coastal plain.
And those cities were?
Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod.
And that survival, that ensures that the legacy of opposition continues. It guarantees that the giant problem, so to speak, didn't just disappear with Joshua.
It establishes a crucial long-term conflict. Their survival in those specific coastal cities, it sets the stage for the recurring challenge posed by the Anakites' descendants. This spirit of opposition, embodied in these towering figures, it continued to menace Israel well into the era of the monarchy.
And this is the historical thread that directly foreshadows the appearance of the most famous giant of all.
Goliath.
Exactly. Yeah. Wow, that depth of context really helps us understand the sheer weight of this threat. It wasn't just a big enemy. It was an enemy of divine decree, powerfully entrenched and psychologically paralyzing. Okay, so let's move into the specific confrontations that are recorded in Scripture. Hashtag #22, the biblical narrative.
The biblical narrative is, it's essentially a story that spans generations. It moves from a moment of, as you said, paralyzing collective fear to one of decisive faith-driven victory.
And that first encounter in Numbers 13 is just devastating. I mean, it's devastating because it reveals the depth of Israel's internal crisis.
It's the great tragedy of the wilderness generation. After 40 days of exploring the land, the 12 spies returned. 10 of them delivered a report so full of fear that it derailed God's plan entirely. We often focus on the giants themselves, but the essay rightly directs us to focus on the language of those fearful spies.
And that language is so vivid. We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them.
That image of grasshoppers, it's just heartbreaking, and it encapsulates the ultimate failure of faith. It's not just reporting that the enemy is strong, it's a complete, profound internalization of defeat.
They weren't just describing the enemy, they were describing themselves.
Exactly. They were essentially admitting that they had relinquished their covenant identity. These were the people of the God who had split the Red Sea, who had sustained them miraculously in the desert. And yet, in that moment of fear, they saw themselves as utterly insignificant, negligible, and defenseless.
That self-perception, it just nullifies their entire identity as God's covenant people. They stopped measuring their ability by the promise of their God, and they started measuring it against the physical opposition in front of them.
That is the pivotal insight. Despair took the lead. They focused entirely on their perceived inability when measured against the giants' physical stature and the walls of their cities. And they concluded that victory was just. It was flatly impossible, regardless of who was leading them.
And the consequence of this widespread, fear-driven unbelief was, well, it was catastrophic for the whole nation.
It triggered a national rebellion against God's clear command to enter the land. And this fear led to the tragic consequence of 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, during which that entire generation perished. Except, of course, for Joshua and Caleb. The Anakites, in this initial story, they became the defining, powerful symbol of Israel's failure to trust the Lord fully. They were a test of faith, and the nation failed that test.
It's such a somber illustration of how unbelief, even when it's triggered by very real, intimidating circumstances, can derail God's intended path for decades and cost an entire generation its inheritance.
It really is.
But the story flips completely when the second generation, under Joshua, finally confronts them.
And that contrast between the failure of the first generation and the decisive faith of the second is one of the most powerful theological statements in the entire Pentateuch. 40 years later, under Joshua's leadership, the focus shifted completely. It moved from the size of the giants to the faithfulness of God. Joshua's military campaigns specifically targeted the Anakite strongholds in the hill country of Judah.
So he went right for the heart of their power, the key cities of Hebron, Debir, and Anab.
Yes, he didn't shy away,
Yeah.
and taking these required a concentrated, sustained effort. It demonstrated that God was faithful, but also that Israel had to actively engage in the fight. The narrative summary in Joshua 11 is just. It's astonishingly direct.
It is.
It states clearly that Joshua totally destroyed the Anakites and their towns in Israelite territory, ensuring that, and I'm paraphrasing here, no Anakites were left in Israelite territory. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did any survive.
That one short passage is the theological payoff for 4 decades of waiting. The very enemy that caused an entire nation to perish was systematically removed.
It demonstrates God's absolute faithfulness. The giants who once terrified an entire nation were defeated and driven out, fulfilling the divine word that was given to Moses. And it wasn't a minor skirmish, it was a comprehensive destruction of the enemy's power structure.
And central to this whole conquest is the incredible story of Caleb. I mean, he embodies the direct opposite of that initial grasshopper fear.
Caleb's story is the perfect counterpoint. He was one of the 2 faithful spies in that original generation. And 45 years after the failure at Kadesh Barnea, Caleb steps forward and claims his inheritance. And what does he request?
He asks for the hardest place.
He asks for the inheritance of the former Anakite stronghold, the city of Hebron itself.
And he was 85 years old at this time. That's a detail that just, it's staggering.
It emphasizes the sheer persistence of his faith. Even at the astonishing age of 85, Caleb didn't ask for a safe, easy valley somewhere. He requested the mountain, the hardest place, the very seat of Anakite power. He declared he was as strong then as he was 45 years earlier, trusting not in his aging vitality, but in the Lord's strength to complete the final, necessary expulsion of the remaining Anakites from Hebron and its surrounding hills.
And what I find so fascinating there is that Hebron was the pinnacle of their power. It was the place the spies described as having walls up to the sky. And it's given to the one man whose perspective never, ever wavered. It's just a powerful testament to a lifelong conviction.
It absolutely is. You know, Caleb saw the same giants as the others, but he consistently viewed them through the lens of God's promise. And his story proves that God honors and empowers those who rely upon him, regardless of their age or the physical odds. Hebron, the symbol of impossibility, was handed over to the man who chose divine strength over human reckoning.
Now, despite the success of Joshua and Caleb, we know those remnants survived in the Philistine cities, which means the conflict wasn't fully resolved. It reappeared later, in the days of the monarchy.
And the essay makes this critical connection. The Anakites provided a persistent source of opposition. The story didn't just neatly conclude with the allocation of the land. Centuries later, the challenge of the giants reappeared, this time among the Philistines. And the most dramatic and famous example, of course, is Goliath.
Can we just step back for a moment and truly grasp the physical reality of Goliath as it's detailed in the source? How imposing was this descendant of the Anakites?
Goliath, who hailed from Gath, one of those survivor cities, was described in 1 Samuel 17 as being 6 cubits and a span tall.
Which, in our terms, is.
To really grasp that, we're talking about an individual who is approximately 9 feet 9 inches tall. This was a direct, terrifying, living testament to the Anakites' enduring legacy of opposition and immense size. He wasn't just a big man. He was an architectural force, covered in armor, unbelievably intimidating, standing as the ultimate physical manifestation of Israel's ancient, paralyzing fear.
And David's confrontation with him, that is, so much more than just a lucky slingshot. It's the ultimate replay of the wilderness conflict.
It is the profound climax and resolution of the Anakite challenge in the narrative history. David's victory wasn't merely a military or, an athletic triumph. It was a powerful public theological declaration right there in front of 2 armies that the Lord delivers his people regardless of the adversary's size or their weaponry or their reputation. David did what the original generation failed to do.
He looked past the giant.
He looked past the stature of the giant to the majesty of his God. He established once and for all that the battle truly belonged to the Lord.
The repeated defeat of the giants, from Joshua and Caleb all the way to the young shepherd David, it transforms these historical facts into deep, deep spiritual truths. And that leads us perfectly into the synthesis of their theological significance. #3 theological significance.
Exactly. The presence, the paralyzing fear, and the eventual defeat of the Anakites in the biblical record. I mean, these are not random historical notes. They teach several significant, timeless theological truths about God's character and his interaction with his people.
And the first truth the essay mentions is the fundamental reality of spiritual opposition. The giants is the embodiment of doubt itself.
This is so critical. The physical giants served as a living, breathing temptation to doubt God's faithful word. The Anakites were the visible, overwhelming proof that Israel's greatest obstacle was never the fortifications or the mighty warriors. It was their own internal spiritual battle against unbelief.
So the real battle was inside them.
It was. The essay points out that even though the Anakites were mighty, they were ultimately no match for the omnipotent power of God. And yet, they succeeded in stopping an entire generation simply by creating doubt.
It almost seems, by divine design, that every promise God gives is immediately followed by an obstacle that's designed to test the strength of our conviction in that promise.
That is the perpetual tension of faith, isn't it? The Anakites existed to test whether Israel would choose to rely on sight, that grasshopper self-assessment, or on the covenant promise. And this reveals the profound difference between fear and faith.
We see this difference so dramatically illustrated in the fates of the 2 generations.
Indeed. The generation that chose fear, the one that listened to the 10 spies who saw only obstacles, they perished without ever seeing the promise fulfilled. Conversely, the faithful, primarily Caleb and later Joshua, they trusted God, they entered the land, and they achieved the conquest.
So the giants weren't meant to stop them.
Not at all. The Anakites were not an insurmountable enemy designed to stop them. They were fundamentally an opportunity for God's people to demonstrate active, visible trust in his unmatched strength and his perfect promises. They provided the stage for faith to be demonstrated.
Their total downfall also powerfully affirms God's sovereignty over human history and his role as the ultimate judge.
Absolutely. The Anakites' defeat confirms that the Lord determines the rise and fall of nations. Though they were physically mighty, culturally entrenched, and geographically dominant, they were removed completely because they stood in opposition to God's covenant plan and his people. Their destruction was a necessary fulfillment of God's promise to clear the land of profound corruption, demonstrating that his sovereign will always prevails, no matter what human strength looks like.
And this leads directly back to that strong moral component we talked about earlier, the seriousness of their idolatry.
And the essay is very keen to reinforce this message. The Anakites' immense military strength and their massive defenses, those walls up to the sky, none of it could save them from divine judgment. Why? Because they had abandoned righteousness and were steeped in the worship of false gods. Their history serves as a stark warning.
A warning for us today, too.
A warning for any time. It teaches us that military power, economic strength, cultural reputation, it's all utterly meaningless when it's weighed against righteousness and obedience before the Lord. Their fall demonstrates the ultimate futility of human reliance on might when it's divorced from divine authority.
The essay then pulls the camera back even further, placing the Anakites' removal within the whole scope of God's overarching plan within redemptive history. They were a necessary backdrop.
Yes, they served an essential, if paradoxical, purpose. Their removal was utterly necessary for Israel to successfully inherit and secure the land. And why was that so important? Because Israel establishing itself, maintaining the covenant, securing the proper lineage and location, all of that were prerequisites for the eventual coming of the Messiah.
So every single skirmish against a giant was, in a grand sense, paving the way for the ultimate victory of Christ.
Precisely. The final defeat of Goliath by David is the clearest type, or foreshadowing, pointing directly forward to Jesus Christ, the ultimate son of David. David confronted the physical giant. Christ confronted the greatest spiritual enemies, sin and death. And just as David used unconventional means, a sling and a stone, Christ achieved his victory through means that the world considered completely foolish or weak.
Sacrifice on the cross.
Sacrifice on the cross. That is the greatest paradox of the whole biblical narrative. The ultimate victory was achieved through apparent weakness.
It's the divine signature.
It is. It confirms that the human concept of power is completely inverted in God's economy.
Yeah.
The cross, which seemed like defeat, was the decisive and complete conquest of all opposing spiritual forces. The Anakite story, therefore, is ultimately a testament that the Lord's power is displayed best when the opposition is at its most intimidating.
That theological groundwork is just incredibly rich. It helps us understand that the Anakites are not just historical figures, but they're spiritual principles made flesh. And now we need to bridge this historical and theological gap and bring these ancient lessons directly into the listener's life today. ## for spiritual lessons and application.
Right. The profound relevance of the Anakite story lies in the fact that while the physical giants of Canaan are gone, every serious believer faces modern giants. The spirit of opposition, the temptation to paralyzing fear, the persistent doubt, and, the alluring temptation, those things remain constant.
This is where we need to encourage a sincere inventory. We really have to challenge you, the listener, to look at your own life and ask, what overwhelming giants do I currently face? Are they deep-seated anxieties, relentless financial pressures, difficult relationships that seem beyond repair, or maybe chronic failures in spiritual habits?
We have to identify them, because just like the Anakites, these modern giants appear overwhelming, fortified, and utterly insurmountable to our human ability. But the core lesson must remain constant. God is infinitely greater than any obstacle, no matter how tall the walls are or how paralyzing the fear feels.
Let's return to that critical moment. The spies' failure was rooted in a fear that distorted their reality. They saw themselves as grasshoppers.
That image is so applicable today. By covenant, they were the people of the Almighty God. They had seen miracles, yet fear caused them to lose all perspective of their divine identity. They measured themselves against the giants, and that calculation guaranteed failure.
And the danger for us is exactly the same, isn't it? We measure our weaknesses, our lack of resources, our poor history, or our crushing circumstances against the world's standard of power and success, instead of trusting in the finished work of Christ and the power of the Spirit within us.
It leads to what we could call comparison paralysis. When we look outward and upward at the giant, we shrink inward. Faith, however, the kind of faith Caleb and David had, is the act of correcting that distorted perspective. Faith doesn't deny the giant's fate, it simply asserts that God's power is infinite.
That's a great distinction.
When Caleb claimed Hebron, he wasn't claiming it based on his remaining physical prowess at 85. He claimed it based on the irrefutable faithfulness of the God who had promised it to him 45 years prior.
And Caleb's example specifically highlights the necessity of perseverance, a spiritual lesson that often gets overlooked in the stories of immediate miracles. His victory wasn't instant.
That patience and endurance are so crucial. Caleb didn't receive Hebron easily or instantly. He had to actually confront the remaining Anakites and expel them, fighting the battle to completion even in his advanced age. He trusted God's promise over the long haul and ultimately prevailed.
And that provides tremendous practical encouragement for us.
It does.
Yeah.
We are called to press on in faith even when the battle against a specific giant, be it an addiction, a relational struggle, a vocational challenge, seems long, drawn out, or requires continued disciplined effort. Perseverance is simply faith stretched across time.
And that endurance, especially when you juxtapose it with David's quick, shocking victory over Goliath, it brings us back to that beautiful principle that God often delights in using the weak to shame the strong.
Yes, the biblical text emphasizes that deliberate contrast. You have Saul, the king, the tallest man in Israel, completely frozen in fear, yet the young shepherd David prevails against the massive giant. And David succeeds not because of his skill with the sling, but because he declared his dependence on the Lord. The reason he prevailed was singular. The Lord was with him, and the battle was his.
It's the ultimate affirmation of God's non-human methodology for victory.
It is the continuous echo of the gospel. The essay rightly points out that the cross itself, which to the Roman world was a symbol of total humiliation and weakness, was in fact the greatest victory of all time over the giants of sin and death. And this truth confirms for us that human weakness is often the very stage where divine strength is most clearly and powerfully displayed. Our modern giants are not roadblocks. They are opportunities designed by God to display His glory through our utter dependence on Him.
The story of the Anakites, then, is a perfect spiritual mirror. It forces us to ask, am I viewing the opposition in my life through the eyes of the fearful spies or through the faith of Caleb and David? Am I acting like a grasshopper, or am I walking as the covenant child of the Almighty?
It calls us to look beyond the immediate circumstances and to remember the historical and theological assurances of God's faithfulness. If He can conquer the Anakites and secure the land against such overwhelming odds, He is certainly capable of addressing the modern giants that loom so large in our current lives. #outro.
As we conclude this deep dive, the narrative journey is just so clear. The Anakites were the epitome of intimidating, fear-inducing, opposition-powering figures, fortified cities, and a reputation that paralyzed an entire generation. Yet in the end, their might could not stand against the persistent promises of God.
That's right.
Their defeat, achieved through the systematic faith of Joshua and the enduring conviction of Caleb, secured Israel's inheritance and provided these timeless practical lessons for every believer today.
Their story is a powerful, persistent testimony that God's promises are absolutely sure, His power is greater than any conceivable enemy, and His redemptive plan unfolds relentlessly despite the inevitable human failings of fear and doubt. It secured the physical land for Israel, and it is a continuing reminder for us that faith overcomes fear, God is utterly sovereign, and the victory ultimately belongs always to the Lord.
To bring our deep dive to a close, we want to return to that powerful passage that concluded the essay found in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 9, verses 1 through 3. Moses is speaking to the second generation right before they cross into the land.
And the context here is just crucial. Moses is standing before them, knowing they're about to face the very opposition that terrified their parents 40 years earlier, and he says, "Hear, Israel, you are now about to cross the Jordan to go in and dispossess nations greater and stronger than you, with large cities that have walls up to the sky."
He's not downplaying the threat.
Not at all, he continues. The people are strong and tall Anakites. You know about them and have heard it said, who can stand up against the Anakites? But be assured today that the Lord your God is the one who goes across ahead of you like a devouring fire.
The acknowledgement is so honest. The giants are real, and the fear is understandable because they are stronger than you are. But the assurance is profound and absolute. The Lord your God is the one who goes across ahead of you like a devouring fire. The battle is already secured by His overwhelming, consuming presence. He's greater than any opposition, physical or spiritual, that you will ever face.
So, we'd like to leave you with this final thought to consider. Building on the essay's ultimate redemptive connection, the victory over the greatest giants, sin and death, was secured by the ultimate Son of David, Jesus Christ, through a painful public weakness on the cross. If God used that seeming weakness to achieve the greatest, most definitive conquest of all time, What seemingly insurmountable giant in your life today might God be patiently waiting to use as a glorious stage to display his unmatched, powerful faithfulness?
May you walk today in the profound confidence that the Lord of hosts goes before you, and may your enduring faith overcome every shadow of fear.
We pray this deep dive into the Anakites has provided not only clarity on the text, but deep encouragement for the challenges you face.
We'll see you next time.